This morning we have three presenters, and we're going to go in the order that is listed in the program. Very happy to have Phil Long with us, someone who's worked in ecological economics. I was studying maybe even before Modern Money, came along, and whose work I really respect a lot. And he's come all the way from Australia, and he's been doing some great work over the last 15 years in these areas. Some of it around a journal we collaborated on, the International Journal of Environment, Workplace, and Employment. And this morning his presentation is on establishing an ecological macroeconomic framework.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks very much, Matt. Yes, so as Matt pointed out, and as you can see from the title here, I've basically been working on an ecological macroeconomic framework for quite some time. Sadly, in some ways, I've been doing a lot of other things, so it is progressing very slowly. Basically, this framework that I'm developing is an attempt to integrate ecological economics, modern monetary theory, and some post-Keynesian economics. Before I show you this framework, I'm just going to paint a little picture for you, a bit of a picture for you. I'm going to sprint. Okay, I've got a lot of slides to show. I probably won't be able to show them all, so I'm sorry if I go at such a rapid pace that you've got questions that, based on what I've got to say, you can all, of course, ask the questions if you want clarification once I finish. So I'm basically, in painting this picture, I'm going to start from, for those who've done some economics training or what have you, start with the traditional circular flow model of the economy. Here's what you learn. This circular flow model represents the circular flow of exchange value in the economy. It, of course, represents the economy as an independent system, independent entirely from the natural environment. And, of course, this circular flow model is very useful from a national accounting perspective. Okay, it forms the basis of the expenditure, or what I call the factor payments approach. I don't call it the income approach because I don't think GDP is national income, but anyway, to measuring GDP. Did I get to it? Okay, well, this circular flow model, as I said, it's useful, but it's useless. Completely useless as a means of recognising the biophysical relationship between the economy and the natural environment, where, of course, the economy is entirely dependent upon the natural environment for its maintenance. It's useless in terms of understanding the physical nature of the economic process. And two key elements of the economic process, of course, are production and consumption. So if you do an economics degree, you study production and consumption, but the way you study it has nothing to do with biophysical laws. And of course, both production and consumption are physical transformation processes, and they're subject to the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And I think also that the circular flow model is useless in terms of bringing attention to what ecological economists believe is the important notion of an optimal macroeconomic scale, and I'll talk about that soon. So to better understand these three important considerations, ecological economists don't reject the circular flow model for certain aspects, but in terms of what I've just mentioned there, what's called a linear throughput model. And of course you have the economy as a subsystem of the natural environment, and the figure highlights the fact that the growth and the maintenance of the economy, so the growth of the economy would be the expansion of that rectangle inside the circle, which of course is non-growing and finite, that's the natural environment. And highlights the fact that the growth and maintenance of the economy requires a linear throughput of matter and energy. And by that I mean the input of resources, which is referred to as low entropy matter energy, which of course is then allocated to produce various goods, private goods, public goods and so forth, which are either directly consumed or wear out through use, depreciate and become waste and exit to the natural environment. Some of that waste can be recycled, only materials can be recycled, you cannot recycle energy, and of course recycling materials require some energy. So it's not energy free. Because of the first and second laws of thermodynamics, in quantitative terms, what enters the economy, the matter and energy, the quantity of the matter energy that enters the economy as natural resources will one day exit in the form of waste. It's the first law of thermodynamics, the conservation of matter and energy. You cannot create, nor can you destroy matter and energy. So what goes in is what goes out. Because of the second law, the quality of the matter and energy that enters is superior to the quality of the matter and energy that exits the economy. It enters as natural resources, very useful. It exits as useless waste. Sustainability, ecological sustainability, requires that the rate at which the matter and energy that enters and exits the economy does not exceed the ecosphere's regenerative and waste assimilative capacities. And the quantity of matter and energy embodied in the natural resources that enter the economy, that are used to produce physical goods, must be greater than the matter and energy embodied in the physical goods produced. The reason for that, well, if we just think of, say, E is technical efficiency of production, where Q is the matter and energy embodied in final goods, and R is the matter and energy embodied in natural resources used in production, then E is equal to Q on R, and E must be less than 1. For it to equal 1, it would mean that you might be satisfying the first law, but you'd be violating the second law. For it to be greater than 1, you'd be creating matter and energy. So it must be less than 1. 100% technical efficiency is impossible. So what might this technical efficiency look like over time? It might not be as smooth as this. 1 represents the E equals 1. That's the thermodynamic limit. So over time, and of course above that line would be the immediate waste in production, and below the line would be the matter and energy embodied in physical goods and services. So technological progress, improvements in technical efficiency, all they do is reduce the amount of waste that is immediately created in the production process. Okay? Meaning more of the matter and energy embodied in resources ends up in the physical goods produced. And of course there's a limit to that. So there's a limit to how much waste you can reduce or the wastage of matter and energy involved in the production process. I might point out, this is sort of done over time, but really technological progress is endogenous. Okay, it's not just something that falls out of the sky. I'm not sure if some people here are familiar with a thing called production function and the isequants. Isequants, basically I've got capital and labour, which are usually production functions are just confined to capital and labour. I've got that on the vertical axis, I've called it Z, so just to combine capital, labour, input combination. And on the horizontal axis, I've got natural resources, which are a function of natural capital meaning forests, fisheries, so forth. And what an isequant would indicate, these two isequants, if Q there is equal to 100, in other words, if we were measuring matter and energy in some sort of units and the output was embodying 100 units of matter and energy, then the minimum amount of resources, that asymptote there, is equal to 100. You never reach that because E is less than 1. It's got to be something more than 100. Yet neoclassical production functions, using something like a Cobb-Douglas production function or a CES production function, permit the non-permissible. As long as you're increasing capital and labour, in other words Z, enough to replace natural capital, you can maintain Q at 100, even though the amount of resources that are being used is less, the matter and energy embodied in them is less than 100. So neoclassical production functions permit, in theory, production possibilities that violate the first and second laws of thermodynamics. And I'll come back to this because this other isequant here, which shows a minimum amount of resources that are required to produce a certain amount of output, and it turns out minimum amount of capital and labour as well. I'll come back to that, the implications of this production function a bit later on. So from this we can, it's quite clear that capital, labour and the technological progress embodied in them are never substitutes for R. Capital is not a substitute for natural resources. Okay? If you deplete a fishery, you do not catch the same amount of fish by having more fishing trawls. capital and labour are the efficient cause of production. They are fundamentally different to natural resources. Resources are the material cause of production. Capital and labour transform natural resources into final goods and services. And in fact, you need resources to produce capital and labour. So if we consider the production possibilities, potential output is constrained by the most limiting factor of production. What does that mean? It means if you need to have capital, labour and raw materials in combination to produce goods and services, and you run out of one of them, that's it, you can't produce any more. Right? You run out of natural resources, you can't produce more because you've got some capital and labour left over. Right? If you run out of capital and labour, you've still got natural resources available, you can't turn them into final goods and services. They don't just magically turn into goods and services. You need capital and labour to transform them into goods and services. So if we run out of capital first, of course the aim, if we're interested in full employment, we want to run out of labour first. You want to run out of labour because it means you've got full employment. We always, as I just mentioned, use a combination of capital, labour and natural resources to produce real output. And the significance of that will become obvious as I move on to the framework. So two obvious questions emerge when you view the economic process in strict biophysical terms, in terms of that linear throughput model. First one is, how big can the economy get? That rectangle, how big could it get before the throughput of matter and energy required to maintain it at a given physical scale cannot be ecologically sustained in the long run? That's a biophysical question, and to determine or answer that question, you need a biophysical indicator. The second question is, how big should the economy get before its physical scale is one where the additional costs of growth, of growing the economy, the extra costs, start exceeding the extra benefits? This is a question that very few economists ask and therefore consider. Ecological economists consider this to be one of the most important macroeconomic questions. And of course that's an economic question requiring an economic indicator, and I'll talk about an alternative indicator to GDP to help us answer that particular question. The important thing is that it's most likely that the desirable size of the economy is smaller than the maximum sustainable scale of the economy. And that's important also because most economic systems are beyond their maximum sustainable scale, let alone beyond their optimal scale. So here's a diagram. I'm not going to explain what I mean by uncancelled benefits and uncancelled costs, just think of them as benefits and costs. So moving along the horizontal axis, that would mean that's the size of the rectangle. If you move along the horizontal axis, that rectangle is getting bigger. The physical scale of the economy is growing. The top figure represents the benefits associated with growing the economy. They go up at a diminishing rate. There's nothing controversial about that. Whereas the costs, there's costs associated with growing the economy, whether they be ecological costs, social costs and so forth, they go up at an increasing rate. If we're interested in having a sustainable economy, then there's going to be a physical scale of the economy where if it grows beyond that scale, the amount of matter and energy that must throughput go through the economy will be ecologically unsustainable. So SS denotes the maximum sustainable scale. Anywhere between 0 and SS is ecologically sustainable. Anywhere beyond that is unsustainable in the long run. You can operate to the right of SS for a period of time.
For quantitative terms.
In quantitative terms. No, in quantitative terms. SS, is that where we would like to operate? Of course it's not. We'd like to operate at S star, which is the optimal macroeconomic scale, where the gap, the difference between the benefits and costs of economic activity are at a maximum. And of course, when you're at that point, it means the marginal benefit of growth is equal to the marginal cost of growth. If you go beyond S star, then the marginal cost of growth starts to exceed the marginal benefit of growth, and SEW represents sustainable economic welfare. What's the GPI? Well, that's in fact this alternative indicator that I'll talk about. I might point out that you can shift these curves. So you can shift the benefit curve up and the cost curve down. So you can increase the economic welfare at a given scale. And in fact, you can also alter what constitutes the optimal scale. But bad policy can in fact cause the curves to narrow. And that'll become important when I show a diagram later on. I might also point out whether there are limits to shifting the benefits curve up. Well, that's debatable. There's no debating the fact that there's a limit to shifting the cost curve down, for the reasons I've already given. Thermodynamic limits. The costs here are the ecological costs. From that diagram, ecological economists like to make three distinctions. I guess I've already talked about the first two. The fact that SS constitutes the maximum sustainable scale. That was the one on the right. That was the one on the right. Then there's the optimal scale, S star. And that's, of course, where the marginal benefit of cost, of economic activity equals marginal cost. That's the familiar Winter-Scott rule in microeconomics. A firm increases its output, stops when marginal benefit, in other words, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But at the macro level, economists completely ignore it. Completely, just grow the economy, despite what's happening to benefits and costs. And the third distinction, which ecological economists think is very important, is that up to S star, between 0 and S star, growth is economic. It's increasing benefits faster than it's increasing costs. It's economic. Beyond S star, it's uneconomic. So, personally, I haven't used the term economic growth. So,
That's 20.
is it really? Why does time go so fast when you're presenting?
Time flies when you're having fun.
So I sort of lost my...
Sorry.
Okay.
You told me to tell you. Told me to tell you.
No, that's big. I did. Anyway, I've completely forgotten where I was. Oh, yeah, talking about the difference between economic and uneconomic growth, and the fact that I've never referred to GDP growth as economic growth since about the year 2000. I call GDP growth GDP growth. GDP growth can be economic if it increases benefits more than it increases costs. It can be uneconomic if it increases costs more than it increases benefits. So, what's some evidence in relation to this maximum sustainable scale and optimal macroeconomic scale? This is at the global level. Whoops, is there a little pointer here? Oh, perhaps there isn't. That doesn't matter. What we've got here is, I don't know if people have heard of this before, there's a thing called the ecological footprint. And the ecological footprint basically is a measure of the land area that is required to supply the resources, assimilate the waste and provide the ecosystem services that we currently demand. The biocapacity is what the natural environment can provide for us. It's the land that's available. Right? So it's the land that's required, that's the ecological footprint, the land that's available. At the global level, we've got an ecological deficit, and at present, in order to supply the resources, assimilate the waste and provide the ecosystem services at the level that we currently demand, forever, we need 1.6 Earths. So the global economy's gone beyond the maximum sustainable scale, and most national economies have done likewise, which is important to consider if we've got unemployment and people are talking about increasing aggregate demand to solve the unemployment problem. What about the optimal macroeconomic scale? Well, there's this thing called a genuine progress indicator that not many people have heard of. What the genuine progress indicator involves is about 25 benefit and cost items. And you obviously calculate the benefits and the cost, you subtract the cost from the benefits, and you get that measure of sustainable economic welfare, basically the difference between the benefit and the cost curves. And these studies were done in about the mid-1990s, and you can see in the US and some European countries, there's a tendency for GDP to go up continuously. The GPI tends to go up with it, and then at some point it starts to fall. So for many industrialised countries, the GPI is now falling or plateauing as GDP rises. So for many countries, growth may well be uneconomic. Does this mean that many industrialised countries have surpassed their optimal macroeconomic scale? It's not an indication that they perhaps have. In fact, given that I haven't got a lot of time, I might, well, here's some genuine progress. Per capita GPIs of 7 Asia-Pacific countries. You can see for Australia, the per capita GPI peaked in about 1974. And the interesting thing is that that pink line is Thailand. It reached a peak in 2002. And China 2001, and China was 2002. So China might already be experiencing uneconomic growth. The interesting thing is that for most industrialised countries, the per capita GPI didn't start to drop off or plateau until per capita GDP reached about, in today's money terms, about 30 to 40,000, so let's say US dollars per person. But for Thailand, it was around about 10,000. And for China, it was about $7,000 per person. Now, when these studies first came in, a fellow called Max Neef came up with the so-called threshold hypothesis. Okay, there was a threshold level of per capita GDP, you surpass that and your per capita GPI starts to fall. And it was around that $30,000 to $40,000 mark, which was good news for poor countries, developing countries. Keep going, but it seems that threshold level of per capita GDP is contracting. Why is it contracting? Because the marginal benefits of growth for poorer countries is a lot lower than what it was for countries that grew their economies 50, 60 years ago, and the marginal costs of growth are much higher. So you might get something that looks... Have I got it here? No, I didn't put it in. Oh, anyway. All right, well, I might just jump from this. I've done another study where these are the benefit and cost curves for Australia, and this is a way of indicating how the curves might shift over time, which not only affects the GPI, but where you are relative to the optimal scale, but I really don't have time for that. So what am I going to do? I am going to... I'll have to go to the next, that Word file, because if it's possible. All right, I'm going to have to end the show, aren't I, and go to this. All right, it's a horrible looking thing. All right, what have I basically got on the... in fact, really, I should go to that. Sorry, you cannot possibly fit this on a PowerPoint slide. And you probably think, well, why bother, because it looks so horrible. No, anyway. Okay.
You can zoom several ways, Phil.
No, I think it's better. Don't worry about the writing so much. That top left-hand side there, I've got capital, labour and raw materials. And you can see that labour is the limiting factor of production. See how you've got, if you go up the vertical axis, and of course they're used in combination, you run out of labour before you will run out of natural resources and capital if you produce at the potential output level. Down here I've got your standard sort of ADAS. It's a post-Keynesian AS curve. It assumes constant returns to scale that you use not only in the long run but short run. In fact, one of the assumptions here is that capital is variable in the short run. You're normally told that it's a fixed input. That's nonsense. You run a machine for 1 hour or 10 hours, you're varying it. The reason why there is a fixed cost associated with capital, it's the way you acquire capital. You tend to acquire it up front, you tend to acquire labour and raw materials as you use it. And so as you increase capital, labour and raw materials, given the amount of capital that you've got, of course you're going to spread that fixed cost over the output level, and so firms have downward sloping average cost curves. You might say, well, why is this average cost curve here horizontal? Because the aggregate supply curve is a markup above average cost. That's because at the macro level, what you find if you consider the micro foundations of that ADAS diagram, is that you find that increases or changes in the level of demand within a particular industry and for particular firms does not change the price. Firms will produce where they earn what you might describe as an equilibrium level of profit. If demand goes up, they have excess capacity, they increase their output, they move down their average cost curve, and their profit goes up in the short run. But they don't increase the price. They don't increase the price. They take advantage of the lower average cost. And of course that gets exhausted, that additional profit, two ways: through entry of new firms or expansion of existing firms. Yeah, I won't go into any more detail than that. Now I've got it so that the equilibrium position is such that you've got unemployment. Why have you got that upward sloping section of the aggregate supply curve? That's where you've got mismatches. With relation to any of the inputs, you've got mismatches, either due to deteriorating quality of the inputs, or the fact that you need an engineer and you've got an accountant. And at that point in time, you start to get decreasing returns to scale, which means a given wage level, given price for capital and raw materials, the the average cost will rise. And of course that's reflected in the marginal product, I call it F. There is the marginal product of labour, capital and raw materials is zero. Always zero. Where you're taught that the marginal product of labour, capital and raw materials can be greater than zero. The problem is that when you're talking about marginal product, you're talking about a within process change. You don't start from scratch. If you've used so much capital, so much labour and so many raw materials, resources, and then you add, not use the same capital and raw materials, but add one more labour hour, you'll produce nothing. Absolutely nothing. Okay? You need to use them in combination. So marginal product is only meaningful in terms of a vector of inputs. And of course, given that you've got constant returns to scale, the marginal product is constant. It's positive and constant. Then, of course, it's diminishing because of the diminishing returns to scale, because of bottleneck sort of mismatch problems. And of course, once you reach the maximum output level, the marginal product curve is vertical. I've got the Keynesian ZD diagram. It's different to the standard Keynesian diagram. It usually has labour on the horizontal axis. Pointless, because you need to look at inputs in terms of a vector of inputs. If you want to know what the demand for labour is, you have to derive it. It's derived. You have to derive it because the standard approach is that the demand for labour is the marginal product of labour curve, and marginal product of labour is zero. So you have to derive it.
That's F now.
Is that it?
Well,
Okay, can I just jump to what a job guarantee might do?
Yes.
Yeah, just very quickly. All right. Oh no, this would be pointless, won't it? Okay, I want to show you a comparison. Just give us 5 minutes. Is that all right?
Yes.
Okay. Between your Keynesian, traditional Keynesian pump priming, and the job guarantee. So we've got the unemployment. I know this is a very messy looking diagram, but it's basically the same diagram I had previously. We're going to assume that the government is going to try and achieve full employment with traditional pump priming. So it increases its spending, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. The problem is you've got that upward sloping section of the aggregate supply curve, so it increases the price level. If you assume that wage contracts and whatever adjust over time in response to increasing the price level, what you actually find is that you end up back at the income level that you were. Now, of course, I'm assuming that the AD curve is intersecting with the aggregate supply curve at what I would call the neighbourhood. It could be to the left, in which case an increase in aggregate demand would not increase the price level. But let's assume that we're there. It will increase the price level, and the aggregate demand curve won't shift back. You'll move along the aggregate demand curve. You'll end up at a higher price level, and you'll end up at the back where you were with the same unemployment level. And the reason for that, if we have a look at the diagram with the marginal product of F, what you can see that's that the red, the blue and the green combined is the input bill for the economy. And you can see that it exceeds the total product of F. All right, so you're going to get some inflation. Of course, the increase in aggregate demand through increased spending shifts the D curve. I'm not sure how familiar people are with the ZD Keynesian diagram. That shifts that up, but because of the increase in the price level, the Z curve rises. You end up with an initial increase in F being used, but then it falls back as you move back along the aggregate demand curve back to Y naught. So initially, with the increase in aggregate demand, you get an increase in the amount of output, you get an increase in the amount of capital, labour and raw materials employed. But as you move back along that aggregate demand curve, back to the original Y level, you're back at the original F, and you've got the unemployment. You're back at the unemployment. Okay, now let me just... So, Keynesian pump. Now, you might ask, well, why did it work in the 50s and 60s? Bill Mitchell alluded to some important things in his presentation today. This upward sloping section of the aggregate supply curve is due to a lot of bottlenecks, mismatches. There weren't as many because of the bureaucratic planning that used to, where Bill talked about the fact that There were bureaucracies that could plan ahead, work out what sort of labour skills would be required in the future. There was, of course, also a lot more unskilled jobs, which of course have been exported to developing countries. So there tends to be much greater, or much sooner you experience mismatches. So the NAIRU is much bigger than it used to be. The important thing here, I also want to point out, because I know a lot of people aren't happy with this concept of the NAIRU in this model is always cost-push related. Got nothing to do with aggregate demand. It's not due to excessive demand, as I'll show when we look at the effect of introducing a job guarantee. Okay, with the job guarantee, of course, people who get a job on the job guarantee get paid a minimum living wage. The aggregate demand shifts to the right. What the job guarantee does is it irons out that upward sloping section of the aggregate supply curve. People get paid a lower wage to reflect their lower productivity, if you want to call it that. So you can see there in the wage bill, I've got this little bit of a gap. Those are the people employed on the job guarantee. So you've got a little bit of a blank space there, which would presumably match the green shaded area that overlaps the marginal product of F curve.
That's
so
the 5 minutes.
Right, can I have
Okay.
two?
Up to you. You start when you want to start.
You're next.
Yeah,
I'm just about to finish, I've got to say.
I've only got like 18 minutes.
Right.
But it'd be nice to have discussion because
All right,
you're
okay.
raising
No.
issues that, my head's
I can leave it
exploding.
there. I can leave it there.
No.
But
No,
give us 30 seconds. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
no,
okay.
come on.
Just finish.
All right, and of course, what it also it carries through to other diagrams. The Z curve, rather than having the upward sloping section, you have it's a linear curve to the where you run out of a particular input factor, which will be labour in this case because of the job guarantee. Labour becomes the limiting factor of production. And of course, the aggregate supply curve just becomes a reverse L-shaped curve without the upward sloping section with a job guarantee, which is not the case with Keynesian pump priming. And I guess I can leave it at that, really. Yeah, that's what I'm working on.
I thought you said it was going to be complicated.
Yeah, well, it's not, yeah, well, you know what I mean.
So,
Sorry?
You have a paper.
No, but I can email, I might copyright stuff. But I can provide the slides. I didn't have a paper.
He has written something, it's just not perfect.
No, I haven't written anything. I haven't. No. Okay. I'm taking up more time.
Keynes, in the general theory, held technology constant and income distribution constant. And I mean, many of us understand the historical context in which he was writing, but I'm convinced that he never intended for all models forever in the future to hold technology constant and income distribution constant. And one of the places where Keynes himself discussed technological unemployment was in an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And we've got Mitch Green today, who's going to talk about clean energy possibilities for our grandchildren.
Thanks, Matt. This guy's good. Okay, so you saved me from having to do that segue and transition to Keynes, so I appreciate that. I am a research scholar at the Binzagr Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Because I'm being filmed as well, I should also note that I do work for the Department of Energy, although none of what I'm going to say are the views of the Department of Energy. And shouldn't be construed as views of the Department of Energy. In fact, they probably disagree with what I'm about to say.
We would have assumed that, actually.
Yeah, well, this is being recorded for posterity, so...
But they are the views of Binzagr.
Yes, and the views of views of this radical political ecologist. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to engage in I want to complicate something. You know, people who are interested in the environment and the ecology, you'll read a news clip about some like exciting hot new green tech. You'll read about how the cost curve for you know, renewable energy technology is just plummeting, which is true. You'll read about how you know, in 2020, basically a lithium-ion battery is going to be so cheap you can't afford not to use it. So you read all this stuff, and it's easy to get to this point where you say, well, it's inevitable that we will transition to a 100% renewable electricity economy. It's got to be, because the economics are in the favor. And what I'm going to suggest here is that as we envision that future, we need to situate that within the sort of extant institutions that make up capitalism, which are essentially pecuniary and financial in nature. Okay, and so it's not that you have all these agents out there making the best possible cost minimization choice just as atoms in space, but rather you have going concerns and institutions and business enterprises with balance sheets that have debts associated with them, cost structures that associate with them, and vested interests. Okay, so I'm going to basically, and I'm a little dour on this, I actually think unless we get policy right, we're not going to get to a 100% renewable energy economy. It doesn't even matter what the cool tech is. And if we do, it won't be in time. All right, we're running out of time. We're probably already out of time, I'll be quite honest with you. But it doesn't mean we can't try, and it doesn't mean we can't really put some clean stuff in the ground right now. And so I'm going to tell you how to do that. So, so the kind of first part of the presentation is really designed to explain how electricity works. All right, because I think a lot of us don't really know. We're not electrical engineers. We don't work in the electric power sector. And so you can't just swap a wind turbine for a coal-fired power plant. It's not that simple. Although you can make a transition that works if you use an assemblage of technologies. And then I'm going to explain why some of these financial barriers do exist and what could be resisting forces for that transition. And then kind of help envision an MMT informed policy solution that we can just plug and play. We can use right now and start organizing our politics around it to try to get to a 100% renewable electricity system ASAP. And because I work in the Western interconnection, I work in Portland, Oregon, and I know about the WEC, I'm going to talk about the WEC. All right, but these are ideas that can be extrapolated to a global application. All right, let me begin. Okay, so when I was dreaming up this paper for this conference, and I think I talked to Fadl about it a long time. I've been wanting to write this for a long time. I come from a tradition in economics that I would call post-Keynesian institutionalist. Okay, so that's a tradition that I think has been UMKC has been pretty central in maintaining that and building that. You've got Bob Brazelton, Randy Ray. In fact, last year Randy published an article that basically takes John Fag Foster's insights, who was attempting to, he's this old original American institutionalist, and he was saying, how can we make sense of Keynes from an institutional perspective? And he said trying to apply that to the 21st century, and it's called The Reality of the Present and the Challenge of the Future in the 21st Century, or something like that. Anyway, you can look it up. But in that original lecture from John Fag Foster, he basically makes the argument that whatever is technically feasible is financially possible. If we know how to engineer the solution, if we can arrange in a qualitative sense the technologies we need to solve the economic problem, we can always find the financing. Okay, that is just always an institutional problem. So if you're constrained financially, it's because you need to adjust your institutions. Okay, and so that's the kind of framework I'm setting up here, and I'm going to tell you that the good news is it is technically feasible to transition to a 100% renewable grid today. All right, we have the technology. We have the variable clean energy, wind, water power, solar, and then we have sort of demand side kind of demand reduction programs that we can implement. Like if you have one of those Google Nest auto thermostats, that can get sort of plugged into a central operator's system, and they can decrement your air conditioning for just a half a degree and aggregate up, and you can actually replace a peaking natural gas generator by doing so. So we have all these like really interesting ways we can stitch together the electrical system to manage the supply and demand of electricity. All right, and we can do it without even relying on lithium-ion batteries, although that seems to be sort of the short-run favored solution. It's probably better than a natural gas plant. Probably pretty bad, though, if we were to scale up and produce a bunch of lithium-ion batteries, because there are other ecological concerns at play. But it is technically feasible. This has been demonstrated. There was a paper published 2 years ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Forget the long title, but a team of researchers at Stanford and UC Berkeley demonstrated that they could maintain a reliable grid using a combination of wind, water, and solar power, and then like balancing those sort of imbalances by using sinking heat into a molten salt storage system, or underground, making ice when you don't need the surplus energy, and then using it later for cooling. These sorts of ideas, and then demand response. No natural gas needed, no batteries needed. There's been some debate about that, but the debate is about cost, because they made a pretty ambitious claim. They said it's just as cheap to do this as it is to do it the way we're doing it right now, and they were a little ambitious on that. But I'm saying here that the cost is ecological, okay, not financial. And so if we're coming back to if we're going to use an MMT perspective here, then we can actually dispense with that, say, guess what, we have an engineering solution, let's figure out how to do it, right? Okay, so, but it's not as simple as just saying, I'm going to grab the cheapest technology. Wind power is the cheapest on the variable side, so let's just throw a bunch of wind power in and we've solved the problem. Because the way that it works is that supply must always equal demand. Now, I'm not proposing a Say's law interpretation of markets here. I'm saying from an engineering perspective, your load, your demand, needs to be matched within a very small margin of error with your generation supply in real time, or else the technology doesn't work. Okay, that's how the sort of alternating current frequency response thing works. I mean, the United States, we settled on 60 hertz as the frequency. And so if you have generation imbalances relative to demand, you'll have rolling brownouts, your lights will dim if you still have incandescence, that sort of thing. So there's a reason why supply must equal demand in this framework. And so that's why it can be challenging, it can be costly to integrate these renewables, okay? So what I'm showing you here is, lasers. Renewables tend to be highly variable, okay? It's particularly wind power. It's very difficult to forecast the generation on an hour-by-hour basis. You really need to know it on a 15-minute scale, okay? And so there's some really, really smart people with really fancy algorithms that do a pretty good job at forecasting this, but they always get it wrong, all right? So here's actual historical data within Bonneville Power Administration's balancing authority for total wind generation. And you can see that it goes from zero, all right, the fleet's producing 0 gigawatts or megawatts, and then you have a windy day in the gorge, the Columbia River Gorge, and it shoots way up to over 3,000 megawatts. Okay, that's not a problem because they forecasted it. The red line is their forecast. But the green line is actual. So there's a difference. That's a pretty substantial, that's like 500 megawatts of difference there. And so what you have to do is you have to have excess capacity in reserve. We call those balancing reserves. And you have to decrement or increment, like say your hydroelectric system, to balance the sudden increase in wind supply. And so, and not everyone has a big hydro system like they do in the Pacific Northwest. And there are other problems with that I won't get into for this talk. You can read my dissertation, you'll find all about it. But anyway, like in California and other parts of the Western Interconnect, they use natural gas peaking plants to do this, okay? So, General Electric makes airplanes, they make engine turbines, they also make generators, because you just basically take a jet engine turbine, put it on the ground, and it can change, it can go to full load in like 5 minutes. It's an amazingly fast way to generate really quick ramping peaking capacity to match that load. So that's the wind problem. Here's what's called the California duck curve. All right, if anyone follows energy policy in the West, you'll know that this has been a problem in California for some time. So what this top line shows you is the net load, and net load is defined of load minus like solar and wind, sort of behind the meter. This is the load shape over a typical spring day. All right, so you have your morning peak, everyone goes to work, And they come home, they turn their electricity back on, and then they go to sleep. And the peaks are generally a little higher in the evening. That's 2012. All right, California has pursued aggressive, and good for them, aggressive carbon abatement policies starting in the early 2000s that has resulted in a substantial increase in solar energy generation in the state. And so, you can imagine, solar energy gets generated because of the natural processes of the Earth revolving around the sun. I mean, we all agree that the Earth revolves around the sun, right? And so you'll have a sort of bell-shaped generation profile. And notice that when it's at its as it approaches its peak capacity for the solar plant, that's right when you don't need the energy. Okay, so year by year, you see that the net load curve is just getting pushed down in the middle of the day, and that's what they call the belly of the duck. All right, so this looks like a duck. Here's the head of the duck. There's the tail. And there's the belly. And year on year, and then forecasted to be pretty low by 2020, means that as you got within the last few years, we've seen some weird things happen, like negative prices. If you're an economist and you hear the word negative price, say that's meaningless. It has no meaning. But in the electricity energy imbalance world, it has meaning. Basically, I'm going to pay you to take my energy so I don't face a charge for screwing up the grid, basically. So they're flush with energy in the middle of the day. So energy is basically free, and it's free because no one needs it. Okay, you can't really store it. Well, you can, but it's too costly. But then it has to ramp way up in the evening because the sun sets and people go home. So that difference, that delta between the low point and the high point, means you have to bring online all these resources that are, if you want to use a Ricardian sort of extensive rent metaphor, like really inefficient on the margin. Okay, so you bring online your most efficient capacity resources, and it's an average incremental cost. I don't talk about marginal costs here because those are nonsensical, but it's average incremental costs as you get further and further into less efficient resources, and then by the end of the day, you're firing up things like oil plants, which are really expensive. They have really high heat rates, and a heat rate is your sort of BTUs generated per megawatt hour of energy. All right, so this is creating all sorts of weird cost shifts and weird sort of balance sheet effects for firms. And as I said, I hinted that it's driven by renewable portfolio standards, particularly in California. Carbon cap and trade market exists in California, but it has no teeth. They gave these allowances away. There's no demand for them, and so they're not worth anything. And the legislation around it is a little dicey, and frankly, I think it's a nonsense policy. But we can have a debate about that at the end. And historically, there have been production tax credits on a variable sense. You get a tax credit for how much energy you produce with wind and solar, and you get an investment tax credit for the initial capital and the ground cost. All these policies together, but particularly the renewable portfolio standards, have driven this explosion in renewable energy in California and the WECC in general.
Yes.
10. Okay, perfect. I'm halfway through, so this is exciting. And here's a graph that I actually updated this morning as I was drinking coffee. This is the share of renewables in California starting from 1983 to 2016. And you see, there's a fair amount of geothermal, right? It's, Pacific Crest volcanism there. You have biomass, burning waste, and you're burning gross stuff. Small hydro. California, this is strange. In their policy design, they've excluded large hydro as counting towards these renewable portfolio standards. And there's a Senate bill that they just passed this actually. That's going to go to 100% renewable energy by 2045. And like 40%, that last 40%, I think the language is still in flux, but they want to include large hydro, which would mean you bring in all that power from the Northwest. But anyway, the point being is you can't build new large hydro, so don't incentivize the production of new large hydro. But look at the wind. I mean, wind jumps up and solar just lurches up, and it's because, starting in 2002, they say, all right, we need you to, match load with 20% renewables by 2017. And then, 6 years later, do it earlier, do it by 2010. And then by 2011, they say, forget that, 33% by 2020. And in 2015, they proposed RPS 50% by 2030. And then just like 2 weeks ago, the last legislative session of the year, a Senate Bill 100, which gets you to 100% by 2045 and 60% by 2030, just passed. Okay, so this is like Jerry Brown's last legislative achievement. The point being is it's surprisingly, it shouldn't surprise anyone, but it's very effective. Guess what? When you make a rule, you make a regulation, say you must do this because we're telling you to, they do it. They do it. But you know, okay, so I don't need to, you know, yeah, so I'll talk about this. So it's been very effective. It's driven by RPS, but these policies do have an adverse effect on the balance sheets of like IOUs and load serving entities. All right? So, and as a result, industry hates renewable portfolio standards. They just hate it. My colleagues hate it. Everyone hates it because it generates these negative prices during the middle of the day. There's concerns about whether or not all of this growth in renewable and intermittent generation sources will cause reliability concerns, because there are reliability concerns, okay? Just as a side note, California deregulated their energy market in the 90s. Well, then there was Enron. So, but there's this institution called the California Independent Systems Operators, and it's called CAISO for short. And it's this large, like, market. I mean, it's an instituted set of processes that is crafted to function as a market. But you basically have independent power producers bid in on the margin and sell their energy. And so no one wants to build capacity resources, because it's like you have these fixed costs associated with it. You only use them sometimes. Everyone likes the sort of variable stuff. And so they call it the missing money problem. There's not enough revenues generated in this CAISO market to incentivize the production of these capacity resources. So you do have this kind of reliability concern. And I'm going to show you on the next slide or two that all of this creates upward pressure on rates. So the absurd outcome of all this is that you have negative prices in the generation of electricity, but your rates go up. That doesn't make any sense, right? But it makes perfect sense from a financial standpoint. And of course, industry thinks this is all just, you know, activist policy, just a bunch of tree huggers who don't know anything about the energy sector, which is not entirely untrue. But that's a good thing. That's a good thing. We have solutions. They would prefer some kind of a carbon market solution. You know, it's Pigouvian. It's consistent with a neoliberal ideology. You know, we put emphasis on market design, so we'll just make more markets. You know, we'll have an energy imbalance market, and you know, you can sell your sort of 5-minute deltas back and forth, and we'll solve it. And it also allows, it's going to raise the cost of energy, and it allows the production of like quasi-rents to be claimed by people who own and have claims on the green tech, right? So they love that, but it's not nearly as effective as a renewable portfolio standard. And if our objective function is get there as quickly as possible, then we should go with the most effective thing, in my opinion. All right, so here's why you're going to have these financial sort of like pushback of the policy, is because whether we like it or not, and there are good reasons to have it, most energy is served by utilities that are going concerns, that are business enterprises that generate revenues to sort of sustain themselves. And if you're a Post-Keynesian, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that rates are markups on average cost, okay? So, and it's a prospective-looking cost projection. So you look at your costs over a period of time based upon your best estimates of what you think they may be, and then you spread those over your load, and it gets you to an average cost position, and then you add a markup to service the sort of overhead costs, and maybe you have a risk tolerance, like a risk budget. Maybe you have some shareholders that you're going to try to hide some costs in your rate base so you can get paid. But anyway, that markup is determined by the Regulatory Commission. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that you get hammered in both directions with all this great renewable energy. Your loads go down. One, because people are putting rooftop solar, that's behind the meter, so load just disappears. Conservation, people are buying conservation measures to make their homes more efficient. The technology that comes out is more efficient than the technology that came out 2 years ago, and so all this stuff shrinks the load. So that means even if the costs don't change, your rate goes up because your denominator is falling faster than your numerator. Also, you know, this is a budgeted output kind of framework, and so They have their resource stack that they've allocated to their loads on a forward-looking basis, but sometimes you have more than you need. And so you would sell surplus into the wholesale market, and that surplus would act as a credit against your rates. And that's typically what utilities have relied upon for years. We do this at Bonneville all the time. But renewable portfolio standard land destroys the value of that wholesale energy, because all of a sudden, all this like free energy, and so it's not worth anything on the margin. So that sort of credit that you've grown used to for rate stabilization goes away. So basically, utilities see their rates going up over time, precisely because we're getting more efficient and we're making qualitative shifts in the way we use energy. Right? So they're going to resist. Carbon markets may facilitate this transition. They might. Okay, if you design them right, if you don't give away the allowances and you make the auction price high enough, it's going to cause some relative cost shifts, and things like batteries and things like green tech are going to be cheaper than like a natural gas plant. But it's questionable whether it's effective. There are all sorts of social and economic distributional effects associated with this that if we don't have to play around with them, then why would we? And again, really, who has time for this experiment? Right now they're talking about in California, it would start like in 2030 to have like an effective carbon market design. Who has time for that experiment? If we want to get people off of their cars or to stop burning fossil fuel, we need a completely clean energy, like electricity system, so we can electrify the transportation fleet. Electricity needs to be prime here. So what I'm saying here is that the problems associated with renewable portfolio standards are financial in nature, not technical. And we can basically use MMT to envision a policy framework that would help us mitigate that. All right? And so what I'm going to propose, and I don't have all the details fleshed out, I leave that to the activists and politicians, but maybe I'll spend a few more times in my paper and write it up as a policy brief. So basically you establish accounts with regulatory bodies, public utility regulatory commissions, at Treasury, or some sort of near Treasury style facility. And so every year, all regulated utilities, maybe every couple of years, they have to go up to their regulatory commission and justify their rates. They want to raise rates, they have to justify their rates. They also have to justify their existence. And so what they can do is they can appeal to the commission and say, look, these were the costs that I incurred because of the renewable portfolio standard. And I went out and I acquired this expensive sort of very clean demand response technology, and please credit my balance sheet, all right, to offset that. And the regulatory commission would do so. And they just have a line with Treasury. It's sort of like there's no statutory limit really on the funding. It's really controlled and mediated by the regulatory commission. And you can model this already happens at one institution. You can model this after the 4H10C credit that Bonneville Power Administration already gets today. All right? So the 4H10C credit is named after a section in the Northwest Power Act of 1980. In 1980, Congress passed a law that basically directed Bonneville to operate its system with the sort of public purpose in mind, centered on environment, fish, and wildlife concerns. So you're going to treat conservation as a resource, and you're going to give it primacy, and you're also going to make sure that your dams don't screw up the fish anymore. 2 minutes? Perfect. And so they basically said, we realize it's going to cost you something. There's some opportunity costs incurred with this, and so we're just going to give you a Treasury credit on an annual basis. So the legal argument was that, yeah, sure, BPA is a business enterprise that's self-funded, right? It acts like a business enterprise, but it is fundamentally a public institution. All utilities are public institutions because they're affected with public interest, irrespective of ownership. But BPA in particular is chartered as a public institution. And we don't think, these are public goods, this natural capital stuff is public, it's in the public domain, and we don't think that ratepayers in the region should bear those costs. So we're just going to give you Treasury credit. All right, so we can go back, I'll close the talk by saying, let's go back to Foster, and let's say, and I never really thought I'd be using these principles of institutional adjustment again in my career, but I'm going to do it here. Obviously, an awesome radical solution would be totally nationalize all this stuff and do direct investments with the engineers in control of the system. Obviously, but we don't necessarily have time. We're up against an ecological constraint that requires pragmatic solutions that can be implemented right now and today. So So there's these three principles of institutional adjustment. Recognize the technical primacy, that there are technical constraints, and that your policy innovations will have some interdependencies, right, that flow through the whole system because it's all interconnected, and that maybe your policy design should minimally dislocate that interconnected system. Okay. This treasury credit solution satisfies those three principles with minimal dislocation. You can put it in place right now, and you can go gangbusters on the RPS standards. So it's not a radical solution, but it doesn't need to be. So again, reboot this framing. Think of the grandchildren, right? There might be more efficient economic solutions, but we can't afford to gamble on our grandchildren's future. We can't afford to leave them a climate debt that they can never repay. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, given what you said about, time is the essence, you could change the title of the paper to Possibilities for Our Children.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so. Cost-benefit analysis has already come up. There are situations where cost-benefit analysis, the conditions for its appropriate application are met. In my view, those are not usually when the environment is involved. But Scott Fullwiler has been thinking about what contribution modern money theory can make to cost-benefit analysis, or perhaps critique of cost-benefit analysis from the point of view of modern money theory, or maybe a little strategic essentialism using cost-benefit analysis informed by modern monetary theory. Scott?
Okay, thank you. So, unlike the other two speakers, I am not an expert in ecology. I'm an expert in MMT and policy analysis. And so what I've got here is applying MMT to a particular method of policy analysis that is obviously rather somewhat ubiquitous, right? So, anyway, I'll get started. So most of you know what benefit-cost analysis is, but I thought I'd just throw it up there because there are sometimes people that don't know what it is, and they think, well, how reasonable? We just weigh the benefits and the costs of something, right? That's what we should be doing anyway. That's not what benefit-cost analysis is at all. Okay, well, I mean, obviously they're trying to do that, but there's a very, very particular method. Benefits are determined by what individuals would be willing to pay for risk reductions or for other improvements. Costs are determined by the dollar value of the resources directed to, this is the EPA, so they're talking about pollution and so forth. Anyway, in terms of U.S. government policy, in terms of the law, there's only one federal environmental statute, Safe Drinking Water Act, that explicitly calls for this. But because of a number of, what's the word I'm looking for? Executive orders and so forth, every major regulation that's expected to have an impact on the economy of 100 million or more, they are required, federal agencies are required to do cost-benefit analysis. Okay. Let's see. So this is just a list of, in the interest of time, I won't go through these, but this is just a list of some of the major regulatory, we'll call them directives for now, and just to show you that this goes across Democratic and Republican administrations. And this is actually, Cass Sunstein was Obama's cost-benefit analysis czar, basically. And this is actually from 20 years ago, where he says, the American regulatory state is becoming a cost-benefit state. Okay, which we say benefit cost now. I don't know exactly why that happened, but maybe because it sounds better, right? Okay, so I'm going to go through some MMT principles. Going to basically confront this with some MMT principles. So first off, is it about macroeconomic benefits versus costs, right? Jamie was talking yesterday about how the approach of the future needs to have a macroeconomic approach, right? We live in a world where things are interdependent, okay? So this is the EPA again, talking about what benefit cost analysis is, right? That it will not be true that the benefits exceed the cost for each and every person. However, if the total benefits greater than the costs, then in principle, possible for those who gain to compensate for those who lose, et cetera, et cetera. So that sounds a lot to me like we are doing sum of the parts rather than looking at interdependence, right? So let's look at a few things that are going on here. I just tried to grab simple examples so it would just be quick and obvious. So look down there at costs, where they have engine costs, equipment costs, operating costs. So this was a look at a particular regulatory proposal. So when I look at that, I think, is that a macroeconomic cost that some businesses are going to have to spend more on their engines and are going to have to spend more on their equipment and their operations? Is that a macroeconomic cost? Right? Not necessarily, right? There's multiplier effects. There's things one person's spending is another person's income, et cetera. Right? Here's an analysis that they did of the Clean Air Act. Now this turned out really nice, right? All kinds of benefits to the Clean Air Act. But if we look at the costs at the top, utilities have some costs, et cetera, et cetera. Are those macroeconomic costs? Right. Well, you would need a different type of analysis for that, right? You would need a macroeconomic model to tell you if there were macroeconomic costs. We're talking about one macroeconomic state versus another one, not summing up, not the sum of the parts. Okay? So you might have seen on the last one there was a measure of the dollar benefits of people that didn't die, right? So just threw this one up there that if you've heard of the dollar value of a statistical life, when you first hear about it, it probably really annoys you. They're trying to allay your fears, right? How much people are willing to pay for small reductions in their risk of dying from adverse health conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And the EPA recommends a central estimate in 2006 dollars of 7.4 million, right? And I don't want to get into all of this, sort of issues that come up. What I'm doing here is complementary to all of the wonderful critiques that are out there of benefit cost analysis. I'm not going to jump in on duplicating what others have said better than I could. But what I would say is the cost to a business of reducing the risk of death of one of its employees a macroeconomic cost? Stop there, right? For a monetarily sovereign government, full employment is a policy choice, right? We know that. So Warren Buffett, a few years ago, said, well, poverty in the U.S. makes no sense. We have $50,000 in GDP per person. Lots of people living in poverty are willing to work. Agree with that. So why do we have poverty? Well, Obama unintentionally explains why we have that, right? We're out of money, right? I don't need to go through all of this stuff. Well, St. Louis Fed explains where Obama's wrong there, right? The sole manufacturer of dollars, blah, blah, blah. We're in MMT here. I don't need to, and we're running short of time, so I'm going to through that. So really, I don't know who did this, but this is really good, and I'd like to give credit, but the extent of my copy and paste abilities was to put Obama's head on Bart Simpson. So I don't know who did the rest of that, but that's really good. Okay, so, but even in the environmentalist community, we have things like this, right? Where it's the vast cost of Katrina, Sandy, it's now obvious we won't be able to afford the growing impacts of climate change, right? Well, we can have full employment now to prevent future Harveys and Irmas, or we can have full employment now not to prevent future Harveys and Irmas, to actually create more of them, right? That's our choice, right? We can in the future have more Harveys and Irmas and still have full employment, right? But what we'll have is full employment cleaning up the mess that the future Harveys and Irmas create, right? And so again, it's about different macroeconomic states and different states of full employment, right? And the notion that we can't evaluate those without somebody putting a dollar value on it should be amazing to all of us, right? Okay. It is nonsensical to measure costs and benefits in terms of something that can be created without limit, right? I mean, we have all sorts of critiques of monetization of the environment, and those are good critiques. But there's one that I haven't heard, which is, well, I think I might skip that one, right? You guys have probably seen this, right? Where basically Greenspan smacks down Paul Ryan on the Social Security issue, right? That great money, et cetera. So St. Louis Fed gets it, Alan Greenspan gets it, right? This one isn't from cost-benefit analysis. This is actually one of the seminal early papers in the natural capital literature from the environmental community, right? And what they did was they tried to come up with a dollar value of the entire biosphere. And there's all kinds of methodological issues within even that literature, right? But from an MMT perspective, if you need $33 trillion a year, you can create $33 trillion a year, right? That doesn't make any sense to evaluate something scarce in terms of something that isn't scarce. Okay, this is a pretty good report from Citi, where again, they told us if climate changes a certain amount, and they gave us 3 estimates, this is how much it'll cost us, right? Over the next, 100 years, if we need 44 trillion, we can create $44 trillion. It's, once again, it's about different full employment macroeconomic states that we might have and evaluating those. I put this in so you could look at the benefits. I'm going to skip that one. I might have had a good reason for that. I wrote a note and I'm ignoring it. But anyway, let's see what time it is. So Greenspan, of course, tells us the cash itself is nice to have now, in the future, whatever, but what matters is the real resources, right? Well, this is also from the Citi paper. And they make some estimates of what sorts of things will happen in the future. Crop reductions, availability of water resources, et cetera, et cetera. Again, do we need to monetize those to evaluate trade-offs between having those problems or having other states of the macroeconomy? Right? Particularly since, again, money is not scarce. For a monetarily sovereign government, the discount rate is a policy lever. This is actually something, I had a working paper a few years ago with the Binzagr Institute, and I'm mostly borrowing in this section from that. Okay, so in this literature, there's all this literature about how to determine a discount rate, right? Because you've got benefits and costs into the future. How do we evaluate those today? Well, they discount them, right? In the never-ending attempt to make the real world look like neoclassical theory, right? We have these theories about how capital markets work and how humans should evaluate what's going on in the future versus now. And so they use this fairly, so a model by a guy named Ramsey that, I don't even want to mess with the details of that. But anyway, they use this to determine, in theory at least, how they should figure out a discount rate for future costs and benefits. So this is a look at this interagency report that was one of the biggest reports, exercises that have been done to try and figure out the benefit today of reducing a metric ton of carbon in the future, okay, the dollar benefit, okay? And the point here isn't what they got. The point is if you look at those different interest rates, how much it changes, right? And if we look here as well, this we already looked at, but they also looked at this with different interest rates. So if we throw 7% in there, there are no costs to climate change, basically, right? If we all have a high discount rate, there are no costs to climate change, right? And so the task in cost-benefit analysis is frequently to figure out what's the right discount rate. And from macroeconomic theory or whatever your approach. There are 2 approaches out there. First one's the positivist view. And Nordhaus, who I believe is a Keynesian, right? I mean, he's sort of an orthodox Keynesian. Well, I don't, but he's orthodox. I'm not saying he's post-Keynesian. But at any rate, we have scarce financial capital, and what we should do is go out and look at the rate that the markets are setting, right? And that's the rate, because the markets are setting the right rate. And the Stern report, this was the alternative view. Stern basically said, he echoed Ramsey, because Ramsey said setting that rho on the right equal to anything that's positive or significantly positive is unethical. So that's why they call this the ethicist view. So they're trying to figure out the right rate, but they're trying to basically say, well, ethically we should have the rho be quite low. And so they end up getting a lower rate than Nordhaus does. So this is a quote from Sunstein, who says, basically critiquing the ethicist view of Stern. We should be, if we really want, if the discount rate is really 1.4, that low, we should be saving vastly more than we do today to leave the ethically appropriate legacy for the future. So what we should do is have policies that dramatically increase savings and investment rates, right? We shouldn't be setting the discount rate at 1.4 in our cost-benefit analysis. We should be dramatically increasing savings so that the market rate falls to 1.4, right? Which is, of course, the loanable funds model of how interest rates are set, right? And we know that in the real world, there's a government that can create its own currency, right? And there is a banking sector, a financial sector that also creates what we call an MMT, horizontal money. And so this market in the real world doesn't exist, right? In fact, it's just wrong. Well, I said it doesn't exist and wrong, they're the same thing. But, okay. Those are synonyms, even though I made them sound like they weren't. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Okay, so I should have flip-flopped that is what you're saying,
Doesn't
right?
exist, but if it did, it would be wrong.
If it did. All right, we'll just keep going then. Okay, so finance is not scarce at the macro level, right? Even at the micro level, you're talking about a bank, but at the macro level, it's not something that's scarce. Oh, what the? Oh, okay. So here's Bernanke. I'm just looking for proof, right? Bernanke tells us the Federal Reserve has no choice but to set the short-term interest rate somewhere. What that means is the Federal Reserve is backstopping the financial system by providing it with the reserves, the monetary base that it needs. And the Fed does that through keystrokes, right? So we're, again, arguing against the loanable funds market. There's no such thing as a purely market-determined interest rate. The Fed sets the interest rate, and you can't not set the interest rate. If you're the monopoly supplier of reserves, you by necessity determine the how others get those from you. If you're the monopoly supplier of anything, by necessity, you are setting the terms that others get them from you. Okay. Even the market, the private interest rates on say corporate bonds and so forth, are significantly influenced. Right? Just go look at what corporate interest rates have done the last 15 years and put it against the Fed funds rate. It's not exact. There's other things going on, and actually those are driven by, in some ways, tax policy, et cetera. Keep putting that over. There we go. Okay, I just threw in Akram and Lee. They presented yesterday where they're showing sort of short-term interest rates of the Fed were driving the longer-term Treasury rates. Okay. So if the first two are true, the discount rate is necessarily a policy variable. Okay? Why do we care about that? Because then the discount rate is a policy variable, not a policy goal. Right? It is not our goal to find the right discount rate and say, do cost benefit with this and that will be correct. It is our goal to have certain values and find a way to intertemporally weight what happens in the future versus today and determine if that is consistent with our policy goals. The goal is not the correct discount rate. The goal is to adjust the intertemporal weight based on our policy goals and our values. So we have outcomes that we think are going to happen, and we compare those to our policy goals. We then adjust policy variables to get different outcomes if that's what we want. Right? So using an intertemporal weighting system derived from an inapplicable capital theory and with no relation to actual ecological processes is an abdication of responsibility to current and future generations, not being responsible to current and future generations. So concluding remarks. I better get this out so I do this. So this came out last December, and what is going on here is to do the social cost of carbon analysis, the Obama administration said use a 3% discount rate. Okay? Trump comes in and they decide to use a 7% discount rate. exact same analysis, essentially, different discount rate. And we know what happens. Cost of carbon is actually negative, right? More carbon in the future is a benefit, essentially when you use a 7%. Same method. What's going on? It's values, and you're hiding behind your values, right? We're pretending that we can't evaluate this stuff unless we do it in terms of money, unless we do it in terms of discount rates, etc. Okay. So we have to make choices. We have to make choices of now versus now. We have to make choices of now versus later, right? But the idea that we can't make decisions unless we bring in an inapplicable monetary analysis is simply ridiculous. Okay. There, that's the end of my talk. Thank you. You have 3 minutes.
I am so happy that I am your colleague in the economics department and the Binzagr Institute. Well, we don't really have much time. I mean, either people will ask a couple questions and we won't have time. So maybe.
Can I suggest that there's
Yeah.
always a food line, so.
Well,
That's
right.
true.
Maybe we should, you know.
I can stick around. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm not the conference organizer, so I mean, there's a.
What do you say?
Oh, okay. So.
So
in
feel free to
10
leave if
minutes,
you need to, though. It won't offend us.
Somebody's going to be speaking at lunch, so I mean.
Oh yeah, we'll leave by then. I was just going to stay like 5, 7,
Okay.
8 minutes.
Yes.
I'll stay.
I'll take 3, and then we'll. Yep.
So thank you for a really interesting panel. I had a question for Mitch in particular. So you were putting renewable portfolio standards against a price on carbon. I guess I don't understand, what's the point?
Well, the point is,
So, can I finish the question?
yeah, sorry.
The two aren't mutually exclusive in any way. I view them as, being complementary policies. So I'm trying to understand that. In particular, you mentioned the distributional consequences, and that gets to your question of policy design. And when we're thinking about the grid, that's one portion, but in terms of actually transitioning to a 100% renewable economy, simply relying on the standards you put forth don't do anything to transition some of the other sectors that are utilizing large amounts of energy. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that. I'm trying to better understand if these need to be posited against each other or not.
And okay. Yep.
Quick question for John. I was wondering in the GPI index, when you show that there's some sort of a divide between GPI and GDP, both in high-income economies and developing economies, do you know what's the main cause for that? Because I know that the GPI has both. Yeah, what's the main cause? The main
Cost.
Yeah, not the cause.
Cause.
Cause. Yeah, sorry, the cause. Because I know that GPI.
Cause.
Yeah, cause. Yeah, because GPI has both social and environmental indicators.
Should I get your grant?
No, it's fine.
And I was wondering if it was coming mostly from social indicators such as well-being, or mostly from environmental indicators.
All right, is there one more? Yes.
For the gentleman in the middle. I wonder, as automation increases, won't capital and labor kind of merge?
Okay, and I would like to add one on top before you give your replies, which is, I had mentioned before about the general theory model not having technical change or, holding income distribution constant. Also, it's a two-sector model. I always thought of myself as a macroeconomist until I got together with my now MMT colleagues. I had a 3-sector model, so I was micro. Yeah. Isn't an input-output model a really good way to integrate the economic and ecological, and I just, maybe the relative cost benefit of the, aggregate demand type model or production function model and so on. And, that's also for the rest of you as well.
All right, shall we answer questions now?
Yep.
Okay. Mark, I appreciate your question. That's actually a really good one. I framed it that way, and I'm not like totally tied to it. I framed it that way just because I'm coming from like a practitioner's industry perspective, and that's how they're framing it. I mean, they see a finite amount of political capital, and they're like, look, if we're going to spend our political capital on something, it should be carbon markets and not RPS. And so I guess, I mean, I would agree. Actually, I think that if it's designed well and you've got a good fee dividend system to redistribute back the proceeds of the thing, with supplementary policy to kind of like help low-income people to like maybe get that clean car or whatever, then yeah, because there's other aspects of the economy that just because you totally electrify the grid doesn't follow that everything just gets electrified. So I think that's a good question, and maybe in like a subsequent draft I'll kind of reframe that. So thanks for the suggestion. Can I address your IO question? I do think an IO model would be a really good way, because the way I tend to think about like sort of like classical Keynesian models is I don't really care so much about the quantitative prices of production and exchange ratios. I care about the qualitative relationships and whether or not the system is feasible. And like I think in an ecological setting, if you've got the wrong qualitative combination of goods, it becomes not feasible. So anyway, I'll just stop there.
I might put up
Who's king?
All right, Scott, why don't you reply while he's trying to find that?
Yeah, very good. Do you want it's the third copy. Right there.
Yeah, because, all right. When I had that diagram before for the uncancelled, I said, look, I'm not going to explain what that means. It sounds strange, but in the uncancelled benefit category, yeah, that's it. No, that's it. Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
But more importantly, this one, which I didn't get to. I'll talk about this one. Strangely enough, there are costs in the uncancelled benefit category. You might say why. It's the uncancelled benefit note, or the notion of uncancelled benefits is based on Irving Fisher's idea of net psychic income. Psychic income is sort of equivalent to utility, but if you subtract disutility, you get a thing called net psychic income. So what I did was of all the costs, the economic, social and ecological costs, I put the social and the economic costs in the uncancelled benefit category. So I just left the ecological costs as the uncancelled costs. They're uncancelled costs because you begin economic activity by extracting natural resources from the environment. And then you have the value-adding process where what someone pays is what someone receives, adding value all the way through the top. And so the final price of goods and services effectively reflects the taking account for compensation for people working if they don't like the form. So there are social costs in that uncancelled benefit category. So if you look at this here, when I did the genuine progress indicator for Australia, you'll notice that other diagram I had where for Australia it peaked in about 1974. In Australia had financial years that start on the 1st of July and finish on the 30th of June. So we sort of say the financial year of 73, 74. No, the next one. Yeah, no, yeah, that one. And so what I did, I'm in the process of trying to estimate the position of the uncancelled benefit and uncancelled cost curves. I did that a few years ago. I've been busy with other things. I'll get back to it at some stage. So I just chose that particular year and 5 years either side. So if you go back to the other one I had, Scott. Keep going. No, keep going. Yeah, that one. So what you got here is you've got, well, it didn't show up there. That's per capita GPI here. Here's basically Australia's GDP rather than the physical split. It was just difficult to come up with a value for the physical, or the value of the stocks that make up the physical scale of the Australian economy. So, in blue is the uncancelled benefit curve and uncancelled cost curve for 1968-69. And 68-69, this would have been Australia's GDP, and the difference would have been the GPI. Then if you go to 73-74, you can see there's the green curve for the uncancelled benefit curve. It's shifted up. And the uncancelled cost curve shifted down. So that the two curves, in fact, the gap broadened. And of course, Australia's per capita GPI increased over that 5-year period. It actually fell in the next 5-year period. And if you have a look at the uncancelled cost curve, just go to that one first, it fell again. But the uncancelled benefit curve fell. And one of the reasons for that was because of the rise in social costs. And if you think about the 1973-74, that was the first oil price shock, and that's where unemployment within Australia basically went from full employment to something quite high. And there were a number of other costs. So one of the main reasons for that decline in the per capita GPI was due to the rise in social costs. Oh, sorry, there was another question too about the automation.
We
Oh.
really have to get.
Yeah, okay, no worries.
Okay. So let's thank our panelists.